Wow, thanks for coming. This is awesome. Hey, Doc. So thanks for coming out. I didn't do any introductions like fancy to come on stage, but I am Sonia, the Purgatory Archaeological Survey, and this is Boots, and we have Shelley Scarrow and Christin Hanley. Do we have the PowerPoint presentation? Sweet. Okay, so you're going to hear a lot of land acknowledgements at the head of every panel this weekend, and for anyone who's gone to a panel in the US or other places, a land acknowledgement's kind of becoming more common, but it's really common here in Canada, which is great. But I do want to preface that by saying land acknowledgements, they're just a starting point. It's important to understand the longstanding history that has brought us to reside on this land and to seek to understand our place within that history. Land acknowledgements did not exist in a past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current and ongoing process, and we still need to build our mindfulness of our present participation, not only here and not only this weekend, but wherever you go visit or work, or wherever you call home. And I encourage all of us to go home after this weekend and continue our self-education of the traditional caretakers of the lands and waters where we live. So I'd like to make a land acknowledgement for Toronto, obviously. So while we're here in Canada this weekend, I encourage us to reflect on the land that we are on, who the traditional keepers of the land are, what the treaty relationship is, or if it's unceded territory. Toronto is located on the traditional lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the traditional territory of the Anishinaabeg, Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee. The territory is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabeg allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to be guests here. And bear with me, I'm going to do one more land acknowledgement because, as you see, I do have a slideshow, and we're going to be talking about historic contexts and events that are going to take place in Tombstone, Arizona. Might have heard of it. So I want to also acknowledge those lands as well. The region of southeast Arizona is part of the traditional ancestral and unceded lands of the Tohono O'odham, Opata, Chiricahua Apache, and other Indigenous peoples who call this area home since time immemorial. We acknowledge the traditional caregivers of these lands and the importance of a commitment to continued self-education, awareness, and actions toward decolonization for the dignity and equality for all. Next slide, please. Okay, I promise to be brief. I promise myself to be brief. I promise my panelists to be brief. We're just going to do a who, what, when, where, and why of the OK Corral to give us some historic context of what we're going to be talking about today. Because I know a lot of people know, but some don't know. So let's just get a little more kind of bearing on what we're referring to. So you see the top row, we have Wyatt Earp, Virgil Earp, Doc Holliday, and Morgan Earp. In the bottom row, Billy Clanton, Ike Clanton, Tom McLaury, Frank McLaury, and Billy Claiborne. So the top row is what we have learned to be through movies and media and everything else, to be the good guys, and the bottom row to be the bad guys. And historically, we hear this group of people down at the bottom, even in the historic court records, to be referred to as the cowboys. And they don't use cowboys how we use the term today. Cowboys then would have been a little bit more derogatory, someone who was more transient, someone who may be synonymous with cattle rustler, which is what the Clantons were kind of involved in. And so you kind of get them kind of lumped together as one group. They probably would have used the term cowhand as like a job title, anyway. But we know Wyatt Earp as like a central figure. That's what we have heard through movies and books and other things over the decades. But really, Wyatt Earp was a temporary assistant marshal. He was second in command to his older brother, Virgil, who was actually a Union veteran, Union War veteran. He was a U.S. Marshal and Tombstone City Marshal. He had actually just recently deputized Wyatt. And then you have Doc Holliday, who was deputized the day of the conflict, of the gunfight. because he knew that they were a little outnumbered and needed some help. And then you have Morgan Earp, the youngest brother, who was the deputy city marshal, who had also just been recently deputized. So we think of Wyatt as a central figure, but really at the time, everyone in Tombstone would have thought of Virgil as like more of the lawman. Next slide, please. So the what? So the OK Corral gunfight was a 30-second gunfight. Like, that's it. It wasn't a long, drawn-out process. It was over before they knew it. The Clantons and Associates, like I said, were the Cowboys, and it was versus the Earps and the Holidays. Virgil survived but was wounded. Wyatt survived just fine. Doc was grazed, pretty unharmed. Morgan was wounded. And Ike survived, and Billy Claiborne survived. Tom and Frank McLaury passed, and so did Billy Clanton. Next slide, please. So when was it? October 26, 1881. The Arizona was still a territory. It wasn't a state yet. They were still kind of drawing out the county lines. The first Tombstone was in Pima County, and then it was in Cochise County. So a lot influx, a lot of newcomers coming into the area, a lot of people not from Arizona coming into the area. None of the Earps were. Doc Holliday wasn't. The Clantons weren't either. So you had a lot of personalities trying to kind of sort of stake a claim in the area, which kind of led to some tensions. Next slide. So obviously it was in Tombstone, Arizona. It was actually behind the OK Corral. It was in front of a place called Fly's Photography Gallery, but that like doesn't have like the same ring to it, like gunfight at the photography gallery. But so the media did its work and sort of, defined it as the shootout at the OK Corral.
There's some good shooting gallery puns in there, though. It was at the photography studio.
Yeah, that's true. They missed out on that one.
Sorry.
No, they needed a writer. Where were you at? A corral is just a livery. Like, it's just a place where you store your horse to like take the saddle off, feed them, water them, store them while you stay the night in the city, or in the town. So the Cowboys had walked through the corral to the backside and then had bought ammunition and then were essentially kind of standing in front of the Fly's Photography Gallery before the Earps and Holiday confronted them. Next slide, please. And so why? This is a really complicated question, which I don't have time to get into, but I will be at the bar later. It's complicated. There's a lot of interpersonal drama between the Earps, the Clantons, and law enforcement. And the Earps weren't the only law enforcement. Like, there was a sheriff in town that also had relationships with the Cowboys and relationships with the Earps, and so there's a lot of interpersonal stuff going on. Political tension, like I said, Virgil was pro-Union and the Clantons were pro-Confederate, and so they had a lot of disagreements there and different cultural perspectives on things. And the Earps were newcomers into the area, trying to stake a claim, and a lot of tension like that. The biggest issue that morning, though, was that the Cowboys had firearms inside the city limits, which was against the law, and the Earps knew that, and so did the sheriff. So when they approached them to say, hey, you need to, give us your firearms, that's when things were really tense, because they knew they were armed, so they knew things could kind of get out of hand, and just a lot of miscommunication. And that is the end of my slideshow. Okay. Thank you, Waverly Earp, for inspiration. So, by show of hands, could you guys tell me if you were familiar with the OK Corral, familiar with Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday, prior to watching the show? Okay. Can you raise your hand if you really weren't that familiar with any of this and had never really heard of it? Awesome. Did you Google it and look stuff up after you watched the show? I'm so glad you're here. So my first question for you guys is, especially as Canadians, what was your familiarity with the Earps, Clantons, and Holidays prior to working on the show?
I went on a road trip with my family when I was 8, and that was pretty much it. So, you see the Disney version of what happened. And we learned a little bit of American history in Canadian history class, but I was always the kid in history who was like, can you tell me what the women were doing? Can you tell me what the people who are marginalized?
The answer's no, we can't.
Yeah, I got kicked out of history quite a bit. So I didn't really know a lot going into the show. And one of the things that I really love about my job is that I become a subject matter expert for about 6 months on something. So you do a really deep dive on Google and you find some documents. And the thing to me that, especially right now, we're sort of struggling with as a society is really understanding that it's not so black and white, that there's so many levels of gray to everything that we don't know about. So that was, for me, really a real thrill to learn about the other side of it as well. Because everybody thinks they're the hero of their own story. And when you read about, these white men who are doing the best that they can, it's maybe not the best for everybody. So it was really thrilling to learn about that and to find out more with this show.
I'm a history nerd as well, and would do my best not to get kicked out of history class because it was my favorite. I will say that cowboys are sort of just a mythological thing that we all learn about, but part of that comes from this story, and part of that comes from what Wyatt Earp did in his life afterward. So I think that a lot of what I knew was what Wyatt Earp had told us. So when we're talking about who gets to tell history and whose voice history is told in, Wyatt lived like 25 years longer than everyone else, partly by design. He killed some of the people afterward. Then he went on to be a boxing referee. Then he went on and worked in Hollywood. So like he had the bully pulpit of telling his story the way he wanted to. There was nobody left to contradict him. And then even after Wyatt Earp died, his wife went on for a number of years telling Wyatt's story because that was where her bread was buttered. So I think I knew the Wyatt Earp version and hadn't thought about all the other versions. So mostly like movies, like Tombstone. That was my relationship with the history. But as a Canadian, we didn't have quite the same Wild West thing. So our framing is always a little bit different. We're always a little bit over here looking at American history. Pierre Trudeau, who was like one of our prime ministers, he's Justin Trudeau's dad, he actually said that being a Canadian is like sleeping in bed with an elephant. They don't know you're there, but if they roll over, you sure as shit notice. And I think, so I think that we as Canadians see a lot of history through this American lens, but we know we're like over here. So we have a slightly different perspective, I guess.
Yeah. No, I like that you brought up the legacy. I mean, we're going to get to a little bit of that, but when I was researching it, that was the thing that stuck out to me was the whole reason why a 30-second gunfight is still a thing in our consciousness is because of timing with the film industry's one. I mean, they're writing books before then, but he lived long enough for movies to be developed.
They hired him as a consultant, so he would be on sets.
Yes.
So like when you think about, this was actually a really anomalous event. There were almost no like standoff gunfights with like a group over here and a group over here and the shade rattle playing and people hiding behind doors. It almost never happened, but the reason we know about it is Wyatt Earp, who had an interest in building this legacy in Hollywood, which we all sort of rest upon as writers. It's like we're battling it on a couple levels.
And nobody really talks about that part of the history, that Wyatt Earp stuck around for that longer. Like, if you look at sort of the history of the OK Corral, there's not a lot about Wyatt after that in that context. So it's really interesting to say that. Oh, sorry. I was just saying that it's there's not a lot of information coming out of Hollywood and about Wyatt Earp sticking around after the OK Corral. So it's really interesting once you dig into it to find out that he is the one who is making that narrative.
Yeah.
So the Clantons are obviously integral to Earp history. They wouldn't be famous otherwise. But we didn't see them come into the show until season 4. Ma'am Clanton is still angry and bitter about the OK Corral. Can you expand on how her character in the legacy of the Clantons was approached, or again, how like the Winners Write the history was factored into the storyline with them?
So once we recognized that we were going to do a time jump between season 3 and season 4, spoiler alert, I assume you've all seen it, we recognized that there was an opportunity with Winona like out of town in the Garden of Eden for like someone new to come in and shape Purgatory in a different way. And we for several weeks, like battled around different options, different people who might come in, what it might look like. And then the day that we landed on the Clantons was like, sometimes you have these hallelujah moments in the story room that you that you live for, and it can be a slog to get to them, but like realizing that this was a perfect opportunity for the Clantons to slip back in was a great opening for us on the story front, and it just helped us like tell a bunch of different stories about Doc than we've told before, and a bunch of different stories about Winona than we told before, and to meditate on what it's like to be the child of conflict and have been vilified. And we don't know how fairly or unfairly. Obviously, Ma'am Clanton we made a choice to make her a very dark character, but her children, who'd sort of been steeped in this legacy of vilification and being hated, there was a chance to talk about some of that unfairness that history can visit upon us, who have to live in it, you know.
Can you like reveal any of the other potential villains you were playing with?
I don't know.
Fine.
I don't want to like break story room protocol. I mean, we talked about Eamon was in there, and we kept him in, but there were a bunch of different Eamons. We sort of had, I said yesterday on the panel, we had a version where like Mercedes was running the town. That was kind of hilarious. We had Kate staying around for longer and taking a bigger role in running the town. There were just like all kinds of different permutations of who might want to run Purgatory.
Awesome.
I don't know if this is like a conscious thing, but I kind of noticed like the parallel of like there's like the Earp curse, and there's almost like a Clanton curse too. They kind of have to bear, and there's parallels between like how Winona handles the responsibility and how the Clanton kids, the Claiborne, kind of handle the responsibility. Like they don't have a choice. They're both born into it, and they handle it differently. And I don't know if that was like a conscious like comparison, but like I felt like it was interesting to kind of look at that and watch that happen.
Yeah, I think we talked at our writers' meet and greet yesterday that like one of the things you sometimes get in a fantasy show like this is you get to write insane things that you wish would happen in the world. There's like a element of wish fulfillment. So the example I used yesterday was like when Bunny Loblaw, who was a homophobe, like falls in love with Waverly. Like that's a fantasy, right? That's so much fun, and you kind of wish you could just go visit that on homophobes, like just. And it was like a similar thing with the Clantons and like wanting to see someone like the sheriff and Doc, these white guys who are built and steeped in like a very macho, colonialist, hardscrabble, like we're always going to come out on top, be the ones who realize that maybe there should be a peace, and to want to get there. That's a fantasy that I, again, would like to visit upon the world. Like, please, could all the leaders just realize that it's not a dick measuring contest, you know?
I really love that. I really love that about this season is that the Clantons weren't all bad. Like, we were really able to see their perspective and to understand that, you know, history has treated them really, really badly. And, you know, they are kind of dicks, but they're doing it because of all the things that history has shaped them into. And I loved, from a fan perspective, that Doc saw this and saw how he had been vilified as well, and he was able to connect the dots a lot quicker than some of the other characters were. I really love that.
Well, because he's been living this long arc of history, and again, that's a fantasy. No one gets to live that long and like see things change and shift and see perspectives. But Doc has that gift, so it was fun to explore that side of him.
It kind of goes to one of the questions I had, where we see Doc and Winona at the museum, and Doc watches that film clip of an older Wyatt being interviewed about the OK Corral and Doc Holliday, and we see Doc's like hurt reaction. Can you speak to that scene?
So that's Noelle wrote that one, I think. Yeah, we were talking sort of before the panel about how we work with history as writers, and what we tend to do, Christin gets to go back into detail, but what you tend to do is read a whole bunch of history and then sort of set it aside and take little bits of it like magpies, just take little bits of yarn and build your own nest out of pieces that you pull from the history. And so Emily had done a lot of research on Wyatt Earp before the show started. So a lot of it was sort of filtered through that perspective. And like, so I don't know, we were just thinking about what it's like when someone else tells your history and when someone else tells your story and how painful that could be. And as, you know, as a society right now that's in the midst of a reckoning with that, in the midst of a reckoning of who tells whose story, who has the right to tell whose story, who shifts it, that was certainly a conversation that was not being had when Wyatt Earp was around. So I think putting Doc there was like a really good personalization of those feelings of like, that's not my story, and you took it and put it in your voice. And it served Wyatt for his friend to have been a fuck up and a hothead. And if that's painful, you know, so we were just sort of exploring that.
No, that's awesome. I also noticed the Tom Mix poster in the back in that scene. And like Tom Mix and Wyatt were best friends. Is that you, Christin?
Not me, but you know what? The cool thing about this show is that because we do have the history of the people working on the show for many seasons, everybody does research. So the research does not stop at the writers' rooms. The art department researches, the costumes department researches, the props department has like 5 million things, and you're like, what the heck? And they're like, everything is period appropriate. And so that was brought in by the art department.
That's
And
great. That's
they really went into like the things that would have been in Purgatory as Wyatt Earp's sort of museum pieces, and they really brought that history to life for us in the museum.
That's great. That also kind of touches on a question I had for like the process. Like, what does it look like between the different departments and individuals when creating the histories and the backgrounds and the context for characters, like script coordinating to props to production? So each department does their own research, and then do they come together and compare notes about things?
We don't have like history meetings to talk about things, but everybody on a production is constantly talking about everything. So there's always meetings about, we'll have like an art department meeting, and we'll discuss like all the tiny little details, and Emily will oversee everything. So she's sort of the brain that goes, yeah, nope. And we are always checking in with each other. One of the things that I really love about my job is that I get to needle myself into other departments. So I can kind of go in and be like, what are you working on? What's this? What's this? Oh, show me this over here. And it's a lot of fun to be able to do that.
Yeah.
But everybody works so, especially on Winona, everybody really loves collaborating together. So we get the ideas from the writers, and then we kind of run with it from there in production.
Very cool. Do you ever feel like a different kind of pressure or responsibility writing for a real life figure like Doc as opposed to the other fictional characters? And what kind of research went into those featured figures like well, obviously Doc, but also like Bass Reeves, who made an appearance on the show?
I wasn't around when Bass was on, were you?
Yeah, I was, yeah.
You were.
Yeah, that was really cool too, because that was another person that I had no idea that he even existed.
Who's fascinating.
He is fascinating and really ahead of his time.
Yeah.
And such an interesting person to be able to bring that to screen and sort of share his story with people who, like me, didn't know about it before. So there was definitely a lot of research for him, and we looked into sort of all of the things that he did and what he was really about, to really portray his story accurately, as accurately as we can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On a
Luckily,
sci-fi show.
like Doc has no direct descendants,
Yeah.
so like you worry a little bit less. Like I've been on shows where we've referenced Elvis, and the legal department's like, cut that out because Elvis's people will sue you into the ground. So there's like a little bit of freedom with Doc because he's almost mythological, and there's no one arguing for his legacy, which maybe is part of why he's so pained at what Wyatt does.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
that makes sense.
It's so interesting, like you guys, when you write historical characters on the show, you try to keep it like as they were, right? Because then I think of like things like Dickinson, where they, oh sorry. Sorry, it's this. I like comparing shows that do like historical, like strict historical context versus things like Dickinson, where while the showrunner would be like, I am the expert on Emily Dickinson. This is historically accurate. She's still saying things like woke and like talking to giant bees and stuff. So it's like those two are very interesting. Like, if you could, would you write something wacky like out of context?
I really love Dickinson. Yeah, I'm such a dunce at history, so for me that opened up the world of understanding Emily Dickinson a lot more than I had before because I'd read a little bit of her poems. I really love that we as writers and filmmakers can play around in those kind of worlds, and we have so many fascinating histories that we don't know about. I didn't know that Emily was in love with her Sue. I didn't know that. So we're at a time now where we're able to take those kind of stories and share them with people who don't know that, and maybe open up the world to understand her a little bit better as an artist. So I think that I would love to work on I love working on wacky shows. I love to work on a wacky show, but also I do love like being able to bring someone to life in true fashion as well as we possibly can.
Sometimes I get like nerdily stuck on the details, and so sometimes I have a hard time with shows that reimagine that are still set like in the time. And that's just sheer nerdery. It's like when people watch Star Trek and they're like, "That's not how gravity works." Like I get a little bit like that sometimes with history shows. So that's why Winona was kind of in the sweet spot for me, because I'm like, there's demons and it's now, so I can buy some of that stuff better. Sometimes I get a bit too dorky to truly enjoy.
Same. Well, in terms of creative writing, like you write a lot of AU fic, and so how much does writing AU fic allow you to explore other elements of characters' motivations or development as opposed to canon? Or especially, I love your yeehaw fics, but can you talk a little bit about like that for you?
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like the same researching the TV characters as maybe I would researching like a historical character, because it's like you have to know them and their facts and you have to know them inside out. So like I have to make those characters still those characters even if they're on The Bachelor, so because if it's Waverly on The Bachelorette, but it doesn't seem like Waverly, it's not, no one's gonna buy it. But so it's like, it's all the research into the characters and just like watching the show 5,000 times and knowing too much about their speech patterns, That's what I.
But even in an historic AU, you can also explore some other elements that wouldn't be would be period appropriate, but you don't see a lot in other media.
Yeah.
Would that be true?
Oh yeah, that's definitely true, because it's like you guys were talking about, the people that tell history, the people that make the media, they're the winners, they're the colonizers at the end of the day. So you have a lot of marginalized people who don't get their stories told. Like the Old West was super queer, and it was super so many people were not white, but you don't see that because it was people like Wyatt Earp telling the story, and so it was him erasing perpetuating. Yeah. So it's like, a lot of people don't know that there's so many gay cowboys. They weren't called cowboys, but they were like married anyways. So yeah, in the writing, I get to like explore all that more than if someone was giving me a bunch of money and telling me who to cast, I guess.
Right.
Which is nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do have a submitted fan question, and I think they meant to put this in terms of the show, but I'm going to make it really broad because they asked, or Pixel He Art Bobo Delgay asked, "What's your favorite and most unbelievable true historical fact?" So I'm just going to open it up to like any historical fact.
I listen to a lot of podcasts, and one of my favorite right now is called Mind Palace. Yep. And he takes stories from history from people that you wouldn't normally hear about and makes them so compelling and interesting. And they're like 15-minute episodes. So I learn a lot about some really cool things that way. But There was one that stuck with me that I heard a couple of weeks ago, and I'm a cat person. And so I really had a good laugh at this, that the very first air-to-radio transmission was from a Zeppelin type of vehicle, and they had taken a cat on board, and so the first was a terrible idea. The cat did not enjoy it, but the first air-to-ground radio transmission was, "Roy, come and get this goddamn cat." And that makes me so happy, and it's just so silly, because you think that they would have some like, "Congratulations, we did it, boys," but instead it's about a cat. So I love
like
that.
the most cat facts. Like,
Yeah.
that's so cat. Like,
This cat lady, yeah.
I love it.
Okay, in the summer of 1855, right here in Toronto, there was a circus from the United States that had set up right down by St. Lawrence Market. And a bunch of the clowns decided it was time to go to a brothel, as you did. So these clowns head up Church Street. They find a brothel, but they found the wrong brothel. They found a brothel that was occupied by a bunch of volunteer firemen. Toronto didn't have an actual fire department at that time. They had like a volunteer fire department, and it was mostly made up of like Orangemen from Northern Ireland, who were like a bunch of tough fuckers. And the clowns made fun of the firemen at the brothel. Apparently, there's a story that like a clown knocked a fireman's hat off, and another clown like butted in line, which in Canada is like the biggest sin you can possibly make. You don't queue jump. But he queue jumped in front of the clown got laid before the fireman did. So they ended up having a big brawl. It was like Friday the 13th, July of 1855. Sorry, is this what your question meant? I could go
it's
on all
exactly
day.
what I wanted. This is everything I hoped for and more.
So the clowns were actually like pretty cool, and they beat the snot out of the firemen. But the firemen were mad. And because they were Orangemen and Toronto was being run by Orangemen at the time, the firemen decided to go down and basically destroy the circus the next day. So there was a huge brawl between all the circus people, literally like acrobats, lions, clowns, and a bunch of firemen. They burned down the circus tent. Apparently clowns were like jumping into the lake in self-defense. The police wouldn't do anything because they were all Orangemen as well. So that was maybe the strangest riot that ever took place, basically where you're standing. And it like reveals a lot about the politics of Toronto and sort of who our police force still are.
Can we write the show, Shelley?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm into it.
I'm sure they weren't in full clown makeup the whole time, but like I definitely imagine them in full clown makeup the whole time.
I think we should.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's important. Okay, so mine is, okay, Lizzie Borden got away with murder because she lied about being on her period. That's my thing. So she got rid of, okay, so there was a bucket of bloody rags under the house.
Yes.
And the police were like, what is this? And she's like, I was on my period.
It's women's business. You don't want to talk about that.
And they're like, our bad, sorry. And she got away with it. Anyways, that's genius. That's mine.
That's a good fact.
Thank you.
What's yours?
I'll tell you. So not a lot of people know about the site, but Cahokia is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it's just outside of St. Louis. It's actually on the Illinois side, and it at one time was the largest city in North America, north of Mexico. And this was prior to any European contact. It was a huge city. I mean, a city by any other definition, no monumental architecture, but these huge mound sites, platform mounds, burial mounds. It was really complex. And then also had all of these little suburbs that like went all throughout the southeastern ceremonial complex. But you can still visit the site today, and like anytime anyone ever tells me they're going to St. Louis, I always tell them about it, and no one has ever heard of it. Even people who live in St. Louis have never heard about it. So if you ever go there, check out this site. It's just a hugely important site in North America, and the visitor center is really cool too. So that's my fun fact and plug. Cahokia Mounds did not pay me to say that.
I don't believe you though.
Well, you'll never know.
Are we all getting a vacation package there?
Yeah,
now?
to St. Louis, yeah.
Sign up with you after.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm going to open it up to any questions. If anyone has any questions, raise your hand. Yeah, Heather.
Sort of a two-parter. Can you explain sort of the significance of the magpies? I'm trying to figure out what the historical reference was to it. And the other one is, have the Clantons always been there, or did they move in, or are we on another AU kind of thing? Like, if you don't want to, but the magpies.
So the magpies were just creepy. I know I know they're a big thing in Calgary too, and you see them a lot. And they actually saw them on set all the time. So I think we just sort of stole that. And also because of who Ma Clanton was, like gathering up little bits of things and like assembling her revenge, it sort of like personified who she was. So I think it was just sort of a channeling of that. And I think what we eventually decided was, because we didn't want the Clantons to be revenants, we wanted them to have come from somewhere else. So they weren't imprisoned by the Ghost River Triangle the same way the revenants were. So I think they came from somewhere else, but we never specified where. But just like we wanted to examine that legacy of like, almost like being raised racist or being raised sexist. Like if you've been taught something terrible, how does that twist you and what does that turn you into? So we brought them from away.
The thing about magpies too is that they're always there. They're always kind of around in the background. And I personally really love corvids because they're so smart. And I think that also really played into the story with the Clantons because, you know, they are gathering things and thinking about things and making these long-term plans like magpies do, which we don't generally think of as birds.
Also, you know what we did was we actually used the actual Clanton brand. So that was like one of those fun things that we got to go back and dig around for. We found like a whole page of the brands that have been used around Tombstone. And since you were very disciplined with your explanation of the OK Corral, you didn't get into it, but there was like a whole bunch of like cowboys stealing cattle and rebranding them.
Yeah.
So that's what we used on the runes was the Clanton family brand.
Yeah, they did. They stole a bunch of other people's cattle, branded them, and then sold them down into Mexico, and would just keep that going. So Tombstone's really close to the Mexican border. They actually stole Wyatt's horse right when he got into town too, which did not help things.
Well, and like the reason there were no guns allowed to be carried was the Earps had actually said that. Mm-hmm. So they had weirdly like set up this situation where nobody else was allowed to have a gun except for them. And so the reason they deputized Doc minutes before the fight was because he was the best gunfighter in town, and they were like, okay, here, you're a deputy. And he was like embroiled in the fight, and like the least appropriate
impartial.
person to be named
Yeah.
as a deputy, but they wanted him to have a gun. Like, that's just shitty behavior.
Yeah, he was actively fighting with Ike. Like that, the night before and that morning, they were actively fighting with each other, and like, here's a rifle.
So like, you
Please
could
come
kind
help
of
us.
see the unfairness and injustice, and we're
Yeah.
getting a 5-minute warning.
Yes. Any other questions? Yeah. Did you hear the question?
So I actually didn't know the hot connection. I wasn't staffed on season 1, and I just learned about it backstage. So
No, we just briefly talked about this. So actually asked Emily this question at Expo because the Hot family name is a really prominent name in Arizona history. And so I asked her, is there any connection to it? Is there any like thread to it? And she, like, short answer, yes and no. She was like perusing some notable names and that were in Arizona during that time period that would be time appropriate. And so Hot came up, she was like, obviously I have to use this name. But there wasn't a specific, like, purposeful, like, Hot family research, have to work this in, and I may or may not have been messaged by a Hot family descendant and on Twitter thinking I was a real archaeological survey because of my threads. Yeah, I had to break that to him. And tell him about the show, but I never heard back from him, so.
Yeah. Isn't that kind of how writing works, though? Is like you're just randomly looking for things, and then you're like, oh, there's actually like connection. It was a happy accident.
Yeah, I think a lot of times too, because you do a lot of research and you absorb things, and then you're like, oh, I had this great idea, and then you look at your notes and you're like, oh, actually, that's because this, and this that I researched 7 months ago, and it just came back into
Yeah.
my brain.
It's also the part where I frequently yell, I'm so glad this isn't a documentary.
Are there any other questions? Yeah.
I wasn't on season 1, so I'm not sure if that was the case. But I think that like Emily and the rest of the team really did so much research ahead of time that I'm sure that there was connections and a lot of thought put into that.
I know I wrote in season 1, I wrote the episode with Levi, the photographer who was a Revenant, and I actually did, like, I knew about the photography studio that was near the OK Corral, and like, I definitely, I know I stole Levi's name, and I wanted to tell a piece of queer history because that's the kind of opportunity that the show offers. So I wouldn't say that Levi and that storyline came from history, but it was inspired by history.
One of the coolest Revenants is the Jack the Ripper one from season 1. Sorry, I know you weren't on that, but like it's so cool because there is that like theory that because the murder stopped so quickly in England, and then there's where a series of murders here. So it's the theory that he just moved and just like kept killing people other places.
There was a Canadian doctor who's high on the Jack the Ripper suspect list. Yeah, I just actually wrote on a show called Slasher. And there's a Jack the Ripper storyline coming up on Slasher that I'm really excited about. And again, like told through a queer lens often. So I love Jack the Ripper too. Is that our next panel, please?
Yeah,
Check it.
I'm ready. I'll do more Twitter threads on it. Any other questions? Yeah.
What was your favorite historical moment that you got to put in the series?
I think when Kate the vampire, it's almost like a throwaway line, but she says people who look like me got written out of history. I'm really proud of that one because I think that that's the point, you know? So I'm proud of that one.
All right, guys, I think that's it. We got our 1-minute warning, so thanks everybody for coming. I really appreciate it.